Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to some of you folks who are joining us from outside India. Today's session 8 of the ongoing AWS Security Masterclass. We're going to be looking at AWS Lambda serverless misconfigurations today. Lambda as a service itself is extremely useful when it comes to short-lived function execution. And we're going to try and set up a couple of labs, and also one of the labs will be required where we'll be taking a look at the internals of Lambda. Not go too deep in, we have an hour, but let's see how far we get ahead with inspecting the container itself. My name is Riaz Walekar. I've been building a SaaS platform for engineers, Cloudl, which takes a look at cloud misconfigurations for SaaS engineers and lets you know what assets are running within your platform and what misconfigurations there are within your infrastructure, along with providing remediation guidance so that you go and then continue doing your productive work instead of banging your head over cloud security. I've got over a decade and a half worth of experience in breaking web apps, mobile, all sorts of infrastructure. I've been doing a lot of cloud infra and container recently. That's my Twitter, and that's the company Twitter. A lot of you are familiar with this exercise by now, but folks who are joining us for the first time, make sure that you go through this short online code of conduct, because this is a public forum. It's a closed door, but it's still a public forum. A lot of you don't know each other within the room, so I want all of us to maintain some decorum for the room. All right, let's jump into today's content. We're going to take a look at try and understand what AWS Lambda is. I'll show you what I've already set up a function which we can take a look at using the AWS console. To my screen share there. And we're going to take a look at a couple of misconfigurations within Lambda. We're going to set up a lab for that. We're going to take a look at a Lambda being overexposed through a permission that's attached to the Lambda, an IAM role that's being overprivileged, and also through the permission on the Lambda itself, like who has invoke and execution powers. and at the end, we'll take we'll get a reverse shell inside a Lambda, running Lambda, and try and see the container environment. All right. How many of you have you used Lambda before? Thumbs up, thumbs down. How many of you have used Lambda simply to start a function to try it out? Yeah. I mean, unless you have like a programming need, most people still work with EC2 instances because with a static IP address and whatever reasons you have to use an EC2 instance. But folks, if you haven't tried, and if you're actually in the dev world, and if you haven't tried a serverless service like AWS Lambda, I would definitely want you to try a hands-on on this, because the entire idea behind Lambda, it being a serverless computing environment, is that it allows you to run your code without having to worry about service. All you need to bring to AWS is your piece of Python, Node, or .NET code, and AWS takes care of scaling and infra. Right. The amazing thing about AWS Lambda is also that you can trigger it based on events, and we're going to see a couple of events in an example that I have. Depending on what events you can actually cause the Lambda's code to execute and then also send data elsewhere, right? Like the example that we will see is where if a file is written to an S3 bucket, then the Lambda executes and you can process the data that comes from the S3 bucket, and you can send an email notification saying, hey, a file was written and the file was processed. Think of the HR company that I keep talking about. When somebody uploads a resume, the resume goes and sits in an S3 bucket. As soon as the file is written to S3, the internal HR can be sent an email saying, hey, file was copied or whatever. A bad example, but there are far more intuitive uses of Lambda because based on the triggers and destinations that it has. It follows a pay per use pricing model. As a free tier user, like most of us, Lambda provides, I don't know the exact number, I've kind of forgotten, but about I think 1 million requests that are free, right? So a lot of requests, right? Don't take million my word for it, but a lot of requests that I have never seemed to run out. I've never been charged for Lambda ever. I've been using it for the last 6-7 years, and I've never been charged for Lambda. Right? So it's an easy to configure service, as well as there's no monetary loss in trying it out, right? So which is one of the few services in AWS that you don't get charged heftily for. Supports a wide variety of programming languages, including Python, Node.js, Java, C#, Go, .NET, right? So we'll see the runtime environment in a case that we've set up. This is an example of the AWS Lambda that I've set up. As a function called Hello World. The content does something else, but the function's name is Hello World. Ignore that. But essentially, you have an S3 bucket that is a trigger. Right? So inputs are triggers for lambdas, and the lambda executes. This is the code that executes within the lambda, and an Amazon SNS service is invoked with certain parameters, so that whatever the functionality within the lambda has computed, that is sent to SNS. Okay? Let me just show you this from the console itself. The code in the presentation screenshot is different than what it is here, so ignore that for now. But if you notice, simple function called hello world, written in Python, right? It simply prints a set of random characters to your screen. The trigger is interesting. The trigger says for any S3 object created, right, in this particular bucket, okay, the lambda is going to get triggered. Okay, that's how it is set up. Specifically, any PNGs. If a PNG file is written to this S3 bucket, the lambda is going to get triggered. Now, in this case, in this particular example, the lambda is not actually processing the data that is fetched from S3. But if you look at the screenshot here, this clearly picks up the data that is the file name of the object written to S3, and then you can perform some action on it, right, based on your business needs. And eventually it sends using Amazon SNS, it sends a asynchronous invocation, which I think I have subscribed to. SNS is another service within AWS. So there's one subscription. This is an email address that is subscribed to this. So technically, if I go to the S3 bucket and this is an inbox. This belongs to this user Riaz Valika test at email. If I write to this bucket, then based on our setup, we first find a PNG to write to this. It's a PNG because that's how the lambda is configured. The trigger being the bucket write. So as soon as the file was written, S3 sends a notification to lambda. Usually folks, devs would, I'm not a dev primarily, but devs would make the function relatable to the S3. In this case, I just set up an example. But in the real world, folks will have the content of lambda to execute based on what input was provided via S3, right? And then an Amazon SNS is received once the processing is completed. So if you notice, I just got a email that says this is ARN bucket name and file information was sent. So saying that this file was written and the size of the file and the bucket name, right? So this information came in through because of the SNS destination that I have set up. Cool. So let's quickly jump into our hands-on scenarios. As I said, there are 3 scenarios I want to cover today. Before we jump into the first one, which is an cross-account permission issue on a Lambda function, let me just show you where this misconfiguration is. So hello world, for example, very simple function simply prints the 32 character string to your response. If I look at the configuration and if I look at permissions, okay, there is this permission that's added, which if you are a dev, you would probably do add permissions, and then AWS account, you would give it a name, test permission, and then in principle, instead of providing the account name, you give a star, right? An action, which is why and this is the caveat with the UI. The UI kind of restricts the actions that the principal can take on this Lambda, right? But it's through the CLI, it's worse, right? If you are a dev and if you are going to be using the CLI to set permissions, it's very easy to make additional mistakes. Here, for example, there are a bunch of Lambda functions, but the UI restricts you to one single action, right? So I would say for all principals everywhere in AWS, only allow get function, right? But interestingly, if you're doing this through the CLI, let me see if I have that. Yep. You can do this, and you can do an AWS Lambda add permission, the function name, action star, and principal star, right? Action star is not allowed in your UI, okay? But using the command line, you can totally do this. And so if I run this, unless it's already added, you see the statement was set. So now anybody who has an AWS account will be able to not only perform invocation, but because action is star, they can actually delete my Lambda. They can download the Lambda itself, right? And that's the first exercise that we're going to pick up. Let's take a look at setting this up. There's no setup basically, but as long as you have your profile set to Masterclass, you're good to go. Technically for this, you don't even need to set your profile to Masterclass because you're going to be, the permission that's assigned to this Lambda misconfigured is that any AWS user can do this. But let's stick to our way of doing things and have your profile set up to Masterclass. Okay, so if I go to the question for you folks is, this is the hands-on video where you're going to try and find out the ARN of the Lambda. It was there on screen. Yeah, we were not paying attention. But there is a Lambda called Hello World in this particular account in the US East 1 region, right? This Lambda has been misconfigured to become accessible by any AWS user, right? So your first task is to invoke this Lambda, right? So to invoke a Lambda, you basically need to run the AWS Lambda invoke command, but you need the function name for this, right? And the function name has to be the full ARN. It can't be simply the function name hello world, right? Because then AWS will not know which account it belongs to. You could also have a hello world in your own account, right? So which is why you need the full ARN. The ARN consists of ARN AWS Lambda and then account name, the function name, and the region. Okay, so you should be able to construct the ARN with the data that's here, right? So let's try and do that. Second question is download the source code of this Lambda and inspect the contents of the Python code. If you have the ability to get function, right? If the permission has been assigned to your user, and simply because we don't know all the ARNs of all the Lambdas out there, right? Could be in millions and billions by now. Because we don't know, we can't inspect every single lambda out there. You understand that statement? Here, because I have told you that this lambda is misconfigured, which is why you will be able to interact with it and download the source code. But there are a lot of lambdas out there which have been misconfigured, and then we have no way of identifying which they are, because the components that are missing are the function name, the account number, and the region as well, right? So let's go ahead and do this. Can you go ahead and construct the ARN of the lambda based on the information, right? So we know it's a lambda, so ARN AWS Lambda, region is US East 1, the account number, what is it? It's a function and the name of the function. This is the ARN, and you should be able to, it's set up in my account, but you would be able to run AWS Lambda invoke with a profile masterclass. Go ahead and try and tell me what you see as the output. By now I'm hoping and assuming that you've enabled autocomplete for your AWS. Makes it so much more easier. Once you tell me that you've run the command and seen the output, I will disable the permission in the lambda so that you get to see the role of the permission itself, right? And how if I had not given star principal, then you would not have been able to invoke it. Go ahead and try this. I'll set one of my Do you all want me to paste this in the chat? The ARN? Yes, no. I've colored the ARN so that you understand the way it is constructed as well. Let me know if you all want me to paste the command. Pretty straightforward. AWS Lambda invoke, function name, and the profile. We've constructed the ARN. You're good to go. What's the output?
We also have to specify the region when.
Yes, you'll have to be you'll have to do a hyphen region unless because default when you set up the profile, right? We had already set it up as US East 1. You'll have to, otherwise if you've not set that environment variable, then it's a random 32 character string, right? So let me just show it to you folks as well. I run STS to show you that I am not in the same account as the lambda. This is an account that I use. It's 89538 and this lambda is in 75019, right? So if I go back to my so ARN AWS region, the account number is 750190494 function, right? So this is the ARN based on the information that we have. I usually export things like these to a variable equal to this that echo lambda created here. So now I can do an AWS invoke function autocomplete, like invoke lambda invoke hyphen function name it, then I give lambda if I hit enter, it will tell me that output is missing. So I need a output file. So I say output dot on. So directory, so a dot this. So a.json has been written. So you see this is the response from the lambda. But if I reset my permissions, okay, actually we'll reset the permission after your second. You need to get the source code of this. So to solve the second bit, the second one being download the source code, you would have to do a get function, right? So run get function on this. The same lambda arn, you're going to do a lambda get function. Again, I didn't use the masterclass profile because this lambda has been misconfigured to give everybody all access, right? Please don't delete it because all of you have delete permissions as well. Right, so if you see here at the end of the output, there's a location, right? Code dot location. This will let you download. You simply browse to this or curl this or wget this, whatever. It will download the zip file that contains the source of the lambda. Right? Very useful in case you identify a misconfiguration, you identify a misconfigured lambda out there, and if you're able to perform get function, highly recommend download the source of the lambda so that you can inspect it for other secrets. Right? A lot of times devs code credentials within it. They also have environment variables that have sensitive information. Like in this case also, when you do get function, there are some environment variables here. I think the other one. Let me show you that other hash master. Add them. So if I go here, there is environment variables. Right? You see these environment variables. These will come up in your get function. So if I do this, they should show up in your it's like different configuration also. Interesting. I change for lambdas. We'll add it to other. But folks, go ahead and try this get function command and get the endpoint so you can download the zip code. The second one requires you to deploy a Lambda in your environment. Give you the shell script here. Do a bash space file name. Create a bunch of resources for you. I'll just reset my account so that I can also run the command with you folks. Go ahead, set up your exercise scenario 2. Let me know if you have any errors. Seems we have identified possibly a bug with AWS Lambda. So the documentation for get function configuration says that we should be seeing the variables in the output. Yeah? You running this on Linux, I suppose?
Yes.
What errors are you seeing?
Calling the get function.
Let me also run it parallelly. Anybody else having any errors? To Call this. Okay, so I have here bash created a role. Oh, is this the function? Is this the error you're seeing? Okay.
Yeah.
Everybody seeing this error? Okay. Let's troubleshoot this. Yeah. So if the function is not created, then this will not run. So we'll kill this. Says the profile can't be the role defined for the function cannot be assumed. Get role. So we'll run. Error is because I know the role was created. Role was created. Join. Okay. So the role's been created. We can confirm that. Troubleshooting basic steps. We're going to confirm if the role has been created by looking at the roles that are currently in existence. Or you see that the role is already here. Okay, and the trusted entity is a lambda, which means that it can be assumed by lambda. So invalid parameter value exception create function. There is an error when it is calling the create function. So if we go to need these two commands.
I tried the.
You tried what?
Maybe.
Possibly because role ARN is created, right? The role's there, and the next is to create the function itself. So the command to do that is AWS Lambda create function. See, I think the wget me to get it's in the other directory. Switch to that. Here. So I do create function. The zip file is in the current directory. The handler is basically the function that has to be invoked when the lambda is run. So oh, there you go, it worked. So you're right. I think there's some timing issue. I've added a sleep, but I had not expected to fail on consecutive attempts. Once that is done, folks, there seems to be a timing issue with the code. So you can go ahead and run the script again, and it should work, even with the errors that it can't find a file or the roles already existing. Yeah. So
Yeah. So I was just.
sorry, I lost you. You're just checking if
If the script is
you're breaking up. What did he say?
the script.
No, it creates a role. It adds a permission to the role, and it creates a function with the particular role that has been created, and it creates a function URL config. Basically gives you the function URL configs are a new thing launched last year in AWS Lambda, where you don't have to have an API gateway to invoke the function, right? You will get an HTTP endpoint by creating a function URL, which is what it creates, and it prints the function URL to you. Now the multiple HTTP thing is being printed because echo command is basically, if I run the as output text, my function URL will be in without the extra double quotes, and then I can simply do an echo, and you should get the actual. Good. So all of you've got a function endpoint like this. Yeah, yes, no.
Yeah.
Cool. So if you take a look at your Lambda now, if you go back to your AWS console and take a look at Lambda, you will actually see that the function is set up and the function URL is also there. So in case you miss the function URL in the CLI window, you can always go back and take a look at your output here. The function is called getMD5 hash. It has no trigger and no destination because we are going to invoke it through the function URL that is created. You can see the function URL here. Okay. If I simply open this in a new tab, right, it says forbidden. You see this?
Yeah.
It says forbidden because there is no there's currently no permission attached to this, right? It is forbidden because your configuration for this, for permissions, does not allow everybody, or rather you, to access it over the internet, right? So to get this done, click on add permissions, go to function URL, select none. Okay, click on configuration. Let me repeat that. Click on configuration, go to permissions, and here under resource based policy statements, click on add permission. Function URL is what we want to be accessible to the internet. Say none here, right? And don't worry, because the URL, the name subdomain in the URL is pretty complicated and random, right? We want the URL to be accessible over the internet for all principles. And what do we need the action to perform is invoke function URL. Okay, save this, and now when you go and reload, it should give you another error. Okay, are you here, all of you? Nice, right? So basically the way the function is set up is that you pass a parameter and it computes the MD5 sum of that string, that whatever you passed. If you go take a look at the source, and that's the question that we are trying to answer, we need to perform a command injection in the Lambda function, and let's take a look at the code to find the coding bug that is there. Okay, so I have the source put up on screen here. You can also see the source in your own Lambda by going to code and click on the app.py file, right? Can someone tell me where the command injection is occurring, or why, which line number is the problem? There is a command injection in this, then we'll see that in a minute, but take a look at the code and tell me what could be the problem. Which line number? Line number 8. Nice. If you look at how this command was constructed, the string that is being received from the user, from the browser, whatever invocation, is being echoed to another program called MD5 sum. Right? Because there is no filtering, validation of the kind of data that string contains, you can pass command separation characters in this and cause some execution. So instead of test, for example, if I do a semicolon, but it has to be encoded, so I'll do semicolon 3b and I do say id, run this command. You see it says echo test, so test got echoed, which is output is here. Is it visible? Right, so if you look at this, it says echo test, test is visible in the output here, and then id is run, but the id's output is sent to MD5 sum, which is this. So command execution is definitely happening, but we can't see the output. Right, to see the output, what we have to do is we have to trick MD5 sum into receiving the output of another command. So I don't know, another id, right? So if I do id here, you see this? So echo n prints test, right, which is here, and then id ran, which is this bit, and then id ran again, but this time output went to MD5 sum, which is here. But this allows us to see the output of program that we are running, right? We can run any commands here. Let's do ls. You see app.py. Are you folks trying this? You don't have an endpoint. In the script that you obtained, the script that you downloaded, there is a create function URL config. Open the script in whatever text editor you're using, and here line number 32, this is what you have to run to create that function URL. Just copy and run this. Okay, it will print the output, will have the URL itself, right? You don't have to worry about the remainder of that's an echo statement, but this is what creates the function URL. Okay, and but to be able to do this on the over the internet, you'll have to assign that permission. You'll have to make it none for function URL. All right. What is of interest to us as attackers is we would want to identify, and the question is, the second question is extract IAM temporary credentials from ENV. Now remember what I said about triggers and destinations, right? AWS Lambda is first and foremost an AWS service, which means that it requires credentials to interact with the other services within AWS, right? And we know that because we added a role to the AWS Lambda function. Okay, so now when we take a look at the environment variables, we will see that there is a session token and an access key and a secret that is created. You see that? The AWS access secret key, and the access key should also be lying around somewhere here. AWS access key. Remember what I said in the EC2 session, that if you have assumed a role, then the access key ID will always start with Asia, ASI. If you're a user, it starts with AKIA. Okay. Go ahead and generate this for your environment. And like any other credential that we've worked in the past, what do we do when we find new credentials? We configure a new profile, right? You can configure a new profile and work with this. So imagine that this was an endpoint on, say, a remote or a different target, right? This was a real world exercise, and let me show you the example of thing I had created, or actually reviewed rather, and created a CTF out of. basically a Lambda function that would operate on the file name of three bucket object. I need to upgrade my hardware. Have you folks configured your profile, the stolen credentials? Remember that it has access tokens as well, which is why you'll have to open the credentials file and add it to the end. This is the function I'm talking to you about. If you notice, it obtains the bucket name and the key, right? And it writes a file, writes the object in a temporary location within the Lambda, right? Once it does this, it performs, or rather it calculates the MD5 sum of the contents of that file, right? You have a file, it calculates the contents of the file because it wants to compute integrity checks on the file that was uploaded. So eventually it stores this in the database, and then if somebody wants to download it, verifies the integrity has not changed. But if you notice, the object name, which is the name of the file that was uploaded to S3, right, is being passed without sanitization to the MD5 sum. So the attack that you just ran, you put a semicolon, an ID, and then again a semicolon. If you create a file in Linux, you can easily create a file on the command line using that has semicolons in it. So if you have a file that says bird.png semicolon ID semicolon ID, that is the name of the file. And if you upload this to S3, S3 will download the file to its temporary location and then perform a cat ID. Right, so command execution happens through the bucket write of an object. Okay, and this was configured to receive data over SNS to an email. So the output of the command ID, instead of being displayed on screen, comes to your email. Okay, because the trigger and the destination was set up that way. All right, I'm moving on. I'm hoping that you folks have created a profile with the stolen credentials, tried it out. Let's try with the next bit. This command basically, I've given the URL in the chat here. This will create a new Lambda function. It has a privileged role again. Creates a function role and a function URL for you, and also sets up an EC2 instance so that you can use it to catch the reverse shell once it's been executed within this Lambda environment. All right. Please go ahead and run this bash space file name. We'll also run this very straightforward setup. I'll actually run it and demo it to you right out. The script will likely complain that the folders already exist. Okay, dash it. It creates a key pair, adds the key pair to AWS, creates a security group. There's a timing issue. Okay, Lambda has been created. Function URL has been created. It will now attempt to create an EC2 instance, which if you've got the security groups error, oh nice, it created the, okay, do you all see this output? If you folks are running this alongside, you will see that an SSH command has been printed and instructions on how you can set up the listener. Okay, so let me go ahead and do that. Window search. There's my SSH key file. This. I'm a little concerned with the security group failing, so let me go and verify that, because I got an error earlier now that it said security group ka there was some laffa with this. Security group has been created, but I don't think it got assigned or the security rules got created. So in that case, let's quickly hop on to our console and look at that EC2. I mean, we have command execution capabilities in our other Lambda that is set up, but this is more of a fun exercise to get a shell and inspect the Lambda environment in a more familiar UI, which is the line. So this apparently has security groups. There is a security group attached, but clearly it does not have inbound rules. See, both the inbound rules are missing. Let's go ahead and quickly add those two inbound rules. I know you're familiar with adding security group inbound rules. You go to inbound rules and say edit. Look at the script. We need two rules. Rule 2. If you look in this inside the script, there is a rule that I need to allow port 999 access from anywhere on the internet 22 so that I can access. So or TCP no 999 4 rule, be able to SSH. This you can keep to yourself or do anywhere. Okay, these two rules are added, so I should be able to SSH. Earlier it was timing out. There you go. Super. I have SSH into the machine. So what I'll do now is I will simply start a netcat listener LVP on port 9999. So that's hard coded script, which I will again go verify. Then the code here. Okay. Code expects an IP address, which then sends bin bash using this file network objects to send the bash over the internet to the IP address that we are providing, right? Basically a socket stream that it is going to be sending, and got a function URL. So let's go ahead and trigger that function URL. Okay, because we see this error, we know that the permissions are already set properly on this. The input we need to provide is question mark IP equal to my EC2's IP address, which did in the output. So while I have this running side and side. So what you have on the left is the invocation of the Lambda. What you have on the right is the netcat listener. I'm listening on 9999 port. Do you see? This is inside the Lambda environment, right? Seems like this container has been used multiple times as well. But if you look at what directory I'm in, and here there's no specific task you need to perform here. Remember that it's not a complete true TTY shell, so you'll not be able to say clear screen and stuff. But right now you're in var task, and if you look at contents of var task, is your code that you had passed. You can print the environment variables to see what else is visible. Right, your access key secret is here. You can follow that. And if you notice, there is an AWS Lambda runtime on localhost port 9001. Right. There is also an X-ray daemon address on port 2000. That particular PIPA IP address. Sometimes you have information that you can pull out of, and this is documented, it's there in the references how you can do this for you folks. But you can make a request to this endpoint and fetch the next invocation, right? So the information that you received in the email, right, the earlier that I showed you, that information is available through this endpoint. Okay. Cool. And this is a very limited environment. Obviously, there is not a lot of which is missing, sudo is missing, right? So you can't, if you can escape out of this into the underlying node that is running this container, make sure that you report it to AWS. They will make a temple out of you because it's not possible to break a lot of security for customers, all of who. Okay. Screenshot of this reference, right? You can go ahead and undo your changes that we've added to the Lambda, including the function that is created, the EC2 instance that was created to cache the reverse shell, 30 groups, and the role that was used to attach the Lambda function. Okay, bunch of resources, specifically the AWS Lambda documentation, security IAM documentation on how you should configure the AWS Lambda IAM role so that you're not over privileging it. And there was a side channel leak that I had discovered where you can use an AWS Lambda resource policy to identify users in another account. Like say if I had Dave's account ID with me, I could use I had written a script for this, published on the Cloudl Academy, where a side channel information could leak from AWS Lambda that would allow me to determine what users are present within Dave's. Right, so a good read. Take a look at that. We've also written a post on AppSeco for Lambda security and runtimes as well as API gateway. Take a look at these resources. Oh, the most important bit of the session. Some of you are so familiar with this feedback form that they know the URL without even looking at it now. Right, so make sure you fill the feedback and let me know what else you need to, if you need me to add to the sessions going forward. We have 2 more sessions remaining. We're going to do RDS next, and eventually the last session is going to be a CTF hackathon sort of thing that we did for session 5. That's all I had for today. You can Cloudl is available for free sign up if you want to use it within your environments. All of the misconfigurations that we've spoken about till date, all of them are detected by Cloudl and more, do far more than the CIS benchmark themselves. The academy is here if you want to go take a look at the technical articles we've been writing, my email and our Twitter and my Twitter, somebody's Twitter. And all right, thank you so much, folks.